The diagnosis that I've given almost immediately suggests what kinds of remedies we ought to have. The problem in the United States and in the world is a lack of aggregate demand. Of course, what one should try to do is to stimulate the aggregate demand in ways that address the underlying problems, that facilitate the structural transformation, that reduce inequality, that reduce the dependence on oil, reduce the need for global reserves. Obviously, financial weaknesses were a key part of this crisis, and that's why a lot of attention has been focused on fixing the financial system. My judgment is that we haven't done an adequate job, and that we need much more stringent regulation of the financial system than we've had. But that is a topic, a subject of a lecture of its own. In the United States, as I mentioned before, 7 million families have lost their homes, and millions more are continuing. The only reason more haven't been thrown out of their homes is our court system is so clogged with so many getting thrown out of their homes. It can't do it. And the banks engaged in massive fraud to throw people out of their homes. You probably all know about the robo-signing, where the bank signed affidavits that they had, in fact, inspected to make sure that people owed the money. They signed an affidavit before the court that they were doing this, when in fact they had never inspected it. They just had hired people to sign thousands of these affidavits. It is really one of the biggest violations of the rule of law that occurred in recent years. I've proposed a way of dealing with it, what I call Homeowners Chapter 11. What is clear, we need carrots and sticks to get banks to restructure the debt. Unfortunately, we've actually given them incentives not to restructure the debt, and very little has been done to address this problem. But I want to focus my time on the problem of increasing demand, government spending, in a world with fiscal deficits. And the problem is that in much of the world there has been a return to the kind of deficit fetishism that interrupted the recovery from the Great Depression. No one would look at a company and look at only one side of its balance sheet, at its liabilities. You would always want to look at both sides, its assets and its liabilities. So deficits can only be assessed in conjunction with how the money is spent. Now, the United States is in a good position relative to most other countries because we've underinvested in the public sector for a generation. Anybody who visits New York and comes into Kennedy Airport and has to get to New York City knows what I'm talking about. I just came back from Asia, and you feel like we are a third world country as far as our public infrastructure. The implication of that is that we have a lot of high return public investments. And given that we have all these high return investments, if we borrowed money, we can, and the United States is in, again, a fortunate position that we could borrow money at close to zero interest rate. Long term, we can borrow it at 2–3%. Real interest rates are close to zero, again. And the returns on these investments are very high. The implication of that is that if we made those investments, the debt-GDP ratio, a short time in the future, will actually be lower, and our fiscal stance would be improved. Well, for some reason, politics in the United States and in many of the European countries makes that impossible. But there's another idea that we used to teach in economics, which was called the balanced budget multiplier. If the government raises taxes and spends the money, Raising the taxes depresses the economy, but spending the money increases the economy. And when you do it in a balanced budget, it actually has a net effect that's positive. It stimulates the economy. And if you do it right, that is to say, you target your taxes in the ways that have the least contractionary effect, and you target your spending in the way that has the most expansionary effect, a balanced budget multiplier, you can get a balanced budget multiplier of around 2 to 3. That is to say, for every dollar you spend, you can stimulate the economy by somewhere between $1.50 and $3. So, in fact, even in a world with fiscal stringency, there are things that you can do to stimulate the economy. And finally, you can always shift the composition of taxes and expenditures to increase GDP by, again, shifting expenditures away from things that don't stimulate the economy to things that do stimulate the economy. Well, while there are lots of things that could stimulate the economy, in many countries we're doing just the opposite. There are cutbacks in spending that are actually depressing the economy. And these cutbacks in spending are likely to impede the structural transformation, which I argued was at the heart of the problem. The reason for that is I described what is going on today as a transition from manufacturing to the services. And what are the services that people really care about? Two of the services that are really important are education and health. But education and health are closely linked with public support. So as we cut back on public sector, we are actually impeding the transition. Well, let me talk a little bit about other alternative policies that might work. Well, one of the things that should be clear is that monetary policy, while it could get you into the mess that it, or at least contributed to our mess, clearly the Fed played a central role in this crisis, it's much more difficult for monetary policy to get you out of a downturn of the kind that we're experiencing. And the kind of, you might call innovative policies like QE2 didn't work. And another bout of it, QE3, are not likely to work either. Well, let me go into, now shift into the next part of the talk, which is how the crisis spread around the world. And the theoretical question I want to ask is, does interconnectivity lead to more or less stability? The answer isn't obvious, but the standard models, the ones that are used by central banks, by IMF, had a clear answer. They assume strong assumptions of concavity in which the spreading of risk leads to better outcomes. And the belief that that was so had an enormous effect on the interpretation of the evolution of the crisis as it began. So right after the bursting of the subprime bubble, Bernanke was asked, how worried do we have to be? And his response was, the crisis is contained, don't worry. And why did he say that? Well, obviously he didn't have the data. He didn't know what was going on. It was all theory. What was his theory? Well, diversification. We've spread the risk around the world, and in an economy, a global economy, in which total assets are, something of the order of magnitude of $120 trillion, a little subprime mortgage problem is minuscule. And we spread the risk around the world, and therefore it can't have any effect. Well, obviously that was wrong. The question then is, where did the models go wrong? Well, one of the answers is that the economic systems are actually rife with non-convexities, for instance, bankruptcy. Moreover, in the presence of these non-convexities, interlinked systems are more prone to system-wide failures with huge cost. This is called systemic risk, and this crisis illustrates the risk. In fact, when you start thinking about it, you realize the kind of incoherence that dominated much of standard macro policy discussions. Because before the crisis, they always talked about the benefits of diversification, capital market liberalization, how global capital market integration is going to lead to more stability. But what did they say after the crisis? They start worrying about, the words they use are contagion. Well, if you have a contagious disease, what do you do with contagious diseases? Normally, you quarantine people. You try to isolate them. You don't want integration, because integration spreads disease from one place to another. You try to create firewalls. So they recognized that after the crisis, we don't want integration, but they talked about the value of integration before the crisis. So they had a kind of cognitive dissonance here. They never tried to balance the benefits and the costs by looking about the world before and after the crisis. There's an analogous problem. With an integrated electric grid, the excess capacity required to prevent a blackout or brownout can be reduced. But what happens is, with an integrated electric grid, a failure in one part of the system can lead to system-wide failure. And that's exactly what happened in the United States. Right after we had an integrated grid in the East Coast of the United States, we had a problem in one little town in Ohio, and the whole East Coast went into a blackout. It was an interesting experiment for all kinds of reasons, what happens when we have no electricity. But the fact is that what we realized then is that integration can have consequences. Well, how do we respond? What we responded is by recognizing that well-designed networks have to have circuit breakers to prevent the contagion of the failure of one part of the system to others. So in other words, we don't want full integration. So the agenda that had been at the centerpiece of the IMF for a long period of time, they tried to change their charter in 1997 to allow them, to give them a mandate to force countries to have full capital market liberalization. We now realize that that mandate was a risky mandate and would have made the global economy more unstable. Well, there are just a lot of equations here that say what I just said. You can the point I want to say is you can formulate these statements in a precise model to assess the trade-offs between integration, the benefits, and the risks. And out of that, you can get an optimal degree of integration. Or more broadly, in a more general system, you can get an optimal economic architecture of the linkages across various units, among banks and among countries. And that's actually a rich area of research that is just beginning to be explored. But among the results that came out of our simple analysis is that full integration never pays if there are enough countries, and that there ought to be restrictions on capital flows analogous to circuit breakers. Interestingly, in their spring meeting last year of the IMF, they finally recognized the desirability of these restrictions on capital flows. There's now developing a large literature on the subject of trying to explore this issue of optimal diversification and the structure of these non-convexities in a variety of stochastic models. One aspect of this is a phenomena we call trend reinforcements. Negative shocks move the economy down further and make it more likely that you run into a problem. And the second has to do with financial interlinkages of something that Bruce Greenwald and I call bankruptcy cascades. As one bank has a problem, it gives rise to a problem in the banks with which it's linked, and that can lead to a cascade of bankruptcies. And whether that occurs or not depends on the architecture, the financial architecture of the system, and a major issue in research is to try to identify what is the good ways of designing those architectures. Well, let me conclude with a few comments on the failures of modern macroeconomics. The test of a science is supposed to be prediction. And it's clear that the standard models didn't predict the financial crisis. But it was actually far worse than that, because the standard models asserted that bubbles can't happen because markets are rational. Standard models asserted that shocks are exogenous, whereas here the key disturbance was a bubble that the market created. And the policy framework suggested that keeping inflation low was necessary and almost sufficient for stability and growth. Government didn't have instruments to prevent bubbles, and it was cheaper to clean up the mess after the bubble broke. Each of these propositions was wrong. And as I said before, even after the bubble burst, standard macroeconomists claimed the effects were contained, and again, they were wrong. It's also clear that the responses to the crisis, based on advice from the standard economic models, has also been clearly inadequate. And, part of the reason that we're continue to be in a downturn 4 years after the beginning of the recession. One of the reasons, one of the aspects of this, and just comment, is that the standard models didn't focus on credit. They talked about money, but not credit. And credit was really at the heart, it was quite an important part in this crisis. They didn't analyze very deeply the inherent deficiencies in securitization. So they hoped that somehow, by waving a magic wand, they could restart the securitization market and mortgages. Still hasn't happened. Again, there was a lot of focus on wage rigidity by some people, particularly in central banks. Again, the evidence is that that was not the central problem. One of the really interesting aspects of what's happened is that while there were large losses associated with the bank's failure to allocate capital efficiently before the bubble broke, the real losses from this crisis have been after the bubble broke. And we should realize the magnitude of those losses. In the United States alone, the cumulative loss, the gap between potential GDP and actual output, is in the trillions of dollars. And globally, it's even larger, obviously. If markets worked well, then the economy would quickly restore to the new equilibrium. And yet, we don't have any theory about why it is that we have not had that kind of quick recovery. That needs to be one of the main focuses of the models, and as I say, the standard models don't do that. So let me conclude. The current downturn is likely to be long, and if something isn't done soon about the job situation, phenomena that used to be talked in the 80s here in Europe called hysteresis effects will set in. That is to say, people lose skills, they become less productive, human capital deteriorates, and the difficulty of getting the economy back to full employment becomes even greater. We create a new normal where rather than having 4% or 5% unemployment, our new normal may be 7, 8% unemployment. And that, of course, if that happens, the financial position of the economy will be even worse. The second important point is the slump is more than a financial crisis. That is to say, we have to look at the underlying real problems and address them. Unless we do so, we won't succeed in recovering, and what we do may even be counterproductive. And finally, I can't help but say that while this crisis, the crisis is not only a crisis in the economy, but also should be a crisis in economics. The standard models, I think, contributed to policies that led to the crisis, and they've given us very little guidance on how to respond. But the good news is that the building blocks with which alternative theories can be constructed are already available. There's been a lot of research going on understanding credit, understanding banks. The real problem was the macroeconomists didn't incorporate these in the standard model that were used at international institutions and the central banks. And that actually means that this is actually a very exciting time for economics, because we now understand some of the failures of the models. We understand what went wrong with the models, and we have a lot of the pieces with which to begin to address these problems. And doing that, I think, is one of the main challenges for the economics profession going forward. Thank you.